Hi everyone, and welcome to day 5 of this year's Confetti Industry Week. And what a week it's been. Don't forget to tag us and use the hashtag IW21 when sharing your posts on social media. Now, we welcome Tess Redburn, who's going to be talking to you about business skills in the creative industries, including freelance versus employment, how to build a portfolio, and freelance project management. Please use the chat functions to ask your questions, and we'll aim to answer as many as we can. Tess studied graphic communication at Bath Spa University, and she went on to become the senior agent at the Central Illustration Agency for 5 years, where she represented a world-class roster of artists working in illustration, murals, sculpture and animation. She now works freelance, managing design projects and marketing for clients such as Untitled Studio and the Association of Illustrators. Tess also works one-to-one with illustrators, helping to advise on portfolios and providing support with negotiating and managing projects. We hope that you enjoyed today's session, and a massive thank you for Tess for taking the time to join us today for our 15th Confetti Industry Week. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Tess. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, thanks for the introduction, Lauren. It's nice to be here. I was actually here last year for Industry Week, so it is nice to be back, but virtually this time. So I will get started. I'm going to share my screen. Lauren, just let me know if this is looking all okay.
Yep, so far so good if you just go to full screen.
Right.
Brilliant.
Cool. So thank you for the introduction. You've basically covered everything that I was going to talk about on this first slide, so that's good. Just an additional one, I'm also doing a postgraduate degree at the moment at Goldsmiths in Brands, Communication and Culture. So I'm also a student, and I know what you guys are all going through with learning remotely. So yeah. Yeah, today I'm going to talk a lot about kind of what is involved with being a freelancer. I've worked with a lot of freelancers. I am also a freelancer myself. There's loads and loads and loads of stuff that I'm going to cover in this lecture. I'm going to whiz through it all really quickly, and you're not going to be an expert by the end of it, but hopefully I'll give you a lot of things to start thinking about as you go out into the world if you're potentially considering being a freelance graphic designer or illustrator or creative. So obviously being a freelancer, there's loads of really great benefits. You get the freedom to work when and where you want. You get a little bit more creative autonomy. That's usually the thing that most people say that they're kind of particularly interested in when being freelance compared to having a job in a design agency. There's also a lot more admin to do and a bit more financial insecurity. So you need to be much more savvy on the business side of things compared to somebody that might have a full-time job. They will have people to organise all of the paperwork and things like that for them. So that's something to bear in mind if you don't like paperwork. Maybe being a freelancer isn't for you. The first thing you're going to need as a freelancer, obviously, is a portfolio. This is how you're going to get most of your work, sending it out to other agencies, potential clients. This is basically your shop window, and it's really, really important. This is kind of a bit of advice mainly for illustrators, but obviously kind of is applicable to graphic designers as well. This is the key thing that I say to illustrators. You always want to be showing a balance between showing the full breadth of what you can do, but also promoting a coherent and a consistent offering. So we hear this all the time for illustrators, and it does apply to graphic designers as well. You've got to really have a style. You've got to have a unique selling point. But within that style, you want to be able to show clients, potential clients and other agencies and things like that, that you are able to do lots of different things within those parameters. So here's a really good example. This is an illustrator called Johnny Wan that I used to represent when I was an agent at CIA. He's an illustrator that's clearly got a very distinctive, very ownable style. I think it's quite original. But within that style, he's saying to clients, look, I can do food and drink. I can do kind of decorative pattern work, quite graphic things, a bit more sort of gradient work. He can do landscapes, he can do characters, he can do people, he can do objects. So he's got his constraints of his style, but within that style, he's showing his clients that he's able to tackle any brief that comes his way. Another really nice thing to see when you're looking at portfolios, particularly of graphic designers and illustrators, is to show your work in context. So here are some really nice examples that I've pulled out from various people's portfolios. Alva Skog is an illustrator. She's done this really lovely editorial piece. And on her website, she's shown a lovely picture of the magazine spread. Caterina Bianchini, she's done this really nice branding project. She's shown it, you know, how it's looking up on a billboard. You quite often see these being mocked up digitally, so don't worry if you've never had your work on a billboard. Why not show how it might look? If you can do that well, it really effectively kind of shows what you're capable of. And then lastly, Utal Studio, which is the design studio that I work with regularly. This is a branding project that we did for a fashion clothing brand, and in our portfolios we very proudly show how the brand lives in terms of the real kind of textual world of the sort of swing tags and labels on the clothing, which always just, you know, catches people's attention. You're unlikely to be commissioned to do something that you can't prove that you can do. So this is really, really important. There's, you know, even after you've finished uni, you need to spend a lot of time kind of building up your portfolio in terms of personal work to prove that you can do as many different things as possible. So if you're an illustrator, like I said, you want to show the breadth of your experience. So you want to be showing that you can do lots of different subject matter, landscapes, people, maps, animals, all of this kind of stuff. If you're a graphic designer, you want to be showing people that you can do the kinds of graphic design that you want to do. If you want to be doing magazine layout, can you do, you know, online digital magazines as well as print magazines, that kind of thing. Make sure you're proving to people that you can do what you want them to commission you to do. So yeah, building your portfolio with personal work, it's an ongoing process. Even illustrators that have been in the industry for kind of 10 years or so, I would still encourage them to go away and do personal work, because like I said, you're not going to be commissioned to do things that you can't prove that you can do. And if you're suddenly thinking, oh, I'd really love to do some kind of, you know, lovely illustrated maps or something, if you haven't got one of those in your portfolio, make sure that you've got it. That if you're going to go away and do these personal projects, always set yourself an imaginary brief for an imaginary client. I find when you look at people's portfolios and they've gone away and done personal work just with kind of no direction and no purpose and no kind of structure, it's always really nice work, but it feels much less kind of tangible and useful in terms of commissioning. So sit down and set yourself like a little brief. Imagine who your dream client is. Imagine what the brief would look like that was coming from them. And quality, you know, be absolutely ruthless with deleting old work. You are only as good as the worst piece of work in your portfolio. So if there is something in your portfolio on your website that you don't feel confident with, get rid of it, because it's not doing you any favors. Your portfolio is not just a dumping ground for all of the work that you've ever done. It is a tool that you need to use in a strategic way to be getting you the kind of work that you want to be getting. Portfolio websites. So this is probably the you know, the way most people are going to see your work. There's a few key tips that I've got in terms of having your work on a website. The first one is, does the visitor get a really good impression of your work in the first 5 to 10 seconds? You know, the people that are commissioning graphic designers and illustrators are probably very, very busy people. You've got to wow them from the second that they come onto your website. If there's a really complicated layout with lots of projects hidden within different categories that you've got to click into and out of, you've just got to imagine that that busy art director or that, you know, busy client is just not going to have time to kind of dig into all of those different layers of your website. Just keep it really simple, really nice and clean. No kind of complicated design layouts distracting from your work. So here's a couple of examples of people that do it really well. This is a graphic designer called Niklas that I've worked with a few times. His website is so minimal, so clean, really nice. Within landing on his page, you're seeing a really nice kind of selection of a few projects. You scroll down and within an instant, you see exactly what Niklas is doing. This is another illustrator. Sorry that the image is not loaded very nicely, but Tatiana Boyko, she's an illustrator again that I used to rep at my agency. This is what you see when you land on her website. Again, it is super simple, super clean, no mucking about. You know, those busy art directors that have clicked on 20 other illustrators' portfolios in that day, they don't have to work very hard to get a really good impression of what Tatiana does. Again, this is a photographer. He's a good friend of mine. Nice and clean, nice and simple. It's all there. Doesn't take much work. A conceptual website is only suitable if it reflects what you actually do as a designer. You know, are you a web designer and you want to show off your skills? Brilliant. This is a designer called Nathan Taylor, who is an interactive designer, and he uses his website as like a testing ground for lots of ideas and things like that. But he's done it really, really well. And so I would only encourage you to go down this route of being kind of experimental with the design of your website, if that is what you're trying to show clients. If you're a graphic designer that is doing sort of print layout for magazines, just keep it as simple as possible. There's obviously lots of other places to show your work other than just your own website. If you're an illustrator, there are lots of directories. So the Association of Illustrators has a directory called the AOI Folios. You have to pay for these, but worth considering. Behance, obviously, I used to spend a lot of time trawling through Behance looking for illustrators and designers and things like that, so it's a good place to go. Lots of other social kind of sites. There's this platform called The Dots, which is kind of a social networking platform for creative people. I think, you know, there's some really good things about it. I'm not sure, but obviously worth considering that each one of these that you kind of set up a profile on, you've got to make sure that you keep updating it regularly. Don't sign up to all the different possible platforms and then let them sit idle and, you know, someone's going to click on it and find loads of work that you did 5 years ago. Just watch out for that. A few other things to consider about your own website. These are just very, very basic web know-how. Loading speeds, obviously make sure that you're not putting on these kind of huge images that take 5 minutes to show up on the site. At the same token, make sure that the image quality is still really good. So there's a balance between that. SEO, I don't know if anyone knows what SEO is. It's search engine optimization. So, you know, there's certain things that you can do. I would encourage you to go and do a little bit of research into SEO. For example, if you're an illustrator that does illustrated maps, you need to make sure that when people search into Google, that it's coming up with the right search terms to find you as a person that does illustrated maps. You know, if you're a graphic designer that specializes in sort of football branding or something, there's loads of really good keywords that you can get into your website to make sure that people are finding your website through Google. But do a bit of research into SEO if you're setting up your own website, because it's really important these days. Domain name, make sure it's something, just your name and easy to find. Make sure you're Googleable. And again, make sure that your website looks good on a mobile and a tablet, because people often forget that. And, you know, remember, a lot of people are going to be sitting on the train kind of browsing through things. So make sure that you're ready for that. Social media, obviously really important. We live in a world of personal branding, and this is our tool. I would be careful of just replicating exactly what you have on your portfolio site. I always say to illustrators particularly, I want to see about 70% of your Instagram is your kind of finished, brilliant, exceptional work. But that other 30%, I want to be seeing like a little bit about you and your interests and your influences, and, you know, what does your studio look like and your work in progress and things like that. I want to be getting a little bit of a taste of kind of the personal life behind the work, which is what your Instagram is really good for. Here is an example of an illustrator who's doing this really well. Her name is Maisie Summer. She graduated last year, I think, or the year before, so she's very fresh out of university, but she's doing a really great job of showing her kind of finished work, plus some sort of, you know, how she's kind of tracing her work in progress and studio shots and things like that. And most importantly, social media is a really, really good tool, but it is not the be all and end all. You know, there's a lot of people who get really bogged down. It really damages people's mental health when you don't, you know, approach it in the right way. Never let it harm your mental health. Clicks and likes are not everything. And a PDF portfolio, sometimes design studios call them credentials. I don't really know why. It's a bit silly, but it's a portfolio. So this is a PDF document that you would have kind of to send to a client that you're already in an email conversation with. So make sure you've got some kind of basic details in there, a little short bio about you, a client list if you work with a client, you know, lots of clients. What expertise do you have, particularly if you're a graphic designer? This is really good to kind of pinpoint the particular skills that you have. You know, can you do Photoshop? Can you do photography? Do you have a bit of kind of basic coding knowledge? That kind of stuff. And obviously your contact details. Consider the pace of this document. Go a little bit deeper into some projects and show a mix of kind of full bleed imagery and thumbnails. Think of it almost like you're designing a really lovely magazine for someone to read. Again, it's not just a dumping ground for all the projects that you've ever done. Curate it in a way that makes it interesting for someone to look through. And again, you can have different versions of this kind of portfolio to send to different clients. You can sort of tailor it. What we do at UTILE is we have like a massive master document, and then we kind of pick and choose particular pages, and we build a little kind of bespoke portfolio depending on what the client's needs are. So these are some pages from our UTILE portfolios, which the team at the studio have kindly let me include in this presentation. We show this client list, which is some of the clients that we work for. Be very careful of doing these logo grids, make sure that they all look perfectly kind of done, don't just slap them on. But this really kind of catches people's attention, and it shows that we're sort of serious because we're working with all these serious clients. Lovely kind of colourful full bleed imagery that just makes you go, wow. And some other kinds of pages where, you know, we go a little bit deeper into the kind of the details of these projects and, you know, our involvement in them and the impact of them and stuff like that. So those are just a few of the pages that would be in this portfolio, just to give you an example of the kinds of different layouts of pages that you can do. Again, this is this Polyking project that we did, a branding project for a fashion sales agency. And the last thing to ask yourself, the purpose of your portfolio is to get you the work. Is your portfolio working to win you the kind of projects that you want to do? I've said this again, not just a dumping ground for every project that you've ever done. Pick and choose the ones that are working for you. Cool. How are we doing for time?
Yeah, we're really good, thank you.
We are doing all right for time. I'm never sure if I'm kind of racing through or I'm going to be
doing well.
Half an hour over. Cool, so that's, you know, just a little flavour of what you need to think about in terms of advertising yourself. So now we're going to talk about kind of what happens once you've done all your hard work, you've done all the marketing, you've done all the advertising, you've sent your portfolio out to people, you've, you know, built up an Instagram following of people that are interested and someone's got in touch. How are we going to manage these freelance projects? I think when I first left uni and I kind of did a few freelance projects of my own, I was just so excited that anyone wanted to work with me that I, you know, dived into these projects without asking the right questions, without making sure I had all the right details locked down and in place. And I was very lucky that I never had any problems. But now I look back on it and I just think, God, if I'd run into the wrong client or, you know, something had gone wrong on a project, I was not prepared for those eventualities. And so I think it's really, really important to make sure before you even set foot on starting putting pen to paper and making any work, that you have loads of things locked down and everything is organized and you know what is going to happen when something goes wrong. The more work that you can put in up front, the easier it makes your life further down the line. So it's really, really important to not get too excited and just start doing the work. Make sure that you know exactly where you stand, what the agreement is between you and the client. So yeah, it's all about dotting the I's, crossing the T's, making sure you're organised. So your client has just got in touch. They've got a new project in mind. First things first, do they have a brief? This might sound like a really basic question. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So yes, this is a really organised client. They've got a brief. They will probably start the discussion with something called a non-disclosure agreement. I don't know if anyone has heard of a non-disclosure agreement. It's worth being aware of what it is. It should basically be a very, very simple kind of pre-contract that just says, we are going to tell you things that are private and confidential, and we want to know that you are not going to go and like blab about this to your friends and post it on the internet and tell everyone what we're doing. It sounds really simple, but you should always make sure you read these contracts, because even though they should just be that, quite often you will get clients trying to slip in really nasty little terms in terms of, you know, copyright assignments and things like that. It's rare, but it happens. And if you haven't read this little document, you might sign away something that you don't want to sign away. So just read it, sign it, send it back. Once that's out of the way, they'll send you a brief. I'm sure you've been working on lots of really good practical briefs at university, but a place I always like to direct people in case you're looking for more examples of some interesting briefs is the DNAD website. They have a really good database of all the kind of DNAD project briefs that they have set as part of the DNAD program, and it's a big archive. And so if you ever want to kind of get, this is also quite useful if you're briefing somebody else and you want sort of a template of what you need to tell somebody, because, you know, on the flip side of being the freelance creative that is receiving the brief, it's actually quite difficult to brief people. So I would recommend going onto the DNAD website and finding all these example briefs. It's an amazing treasure trove of really interesting projects. Also good if you're trying to set yourself some personal work. So once you've seen the brief, had a look, they'll probably send you a contract. There's loads of things to watch out for in contracts. If you're an illustrator and you are worried about contracts, the best thing to do is to sign up as a member of the Association of Illustrators. I, you know, have no kind of conflict of interest. I'm not trying to sell anything, but they do a really brilliant job of, like, they can help you with contracts, and you can send them the contract and they will read it through and just check it over for you. But some very basic things just to kind of watch out for. Payment schedule. You know, you get these big companies that will say, oh, you can send us an invoice at the end of the project and we'll pay within 90 days. 90-day payment terms are not acceptable. You should always push back against those. The standard is 30 days. Basically, you send them an invoice and they have to pay you within 30 days. I think that's fine. 90 days, not so good. Termination fees. What happens if the project gets cancelled halfway through? What are you going to get paid? You need to make sure that that is in a contract. Liability. So if anybody sues the company for something related to the project, make sure that you are not liable for any of that. I know that it all sounds very kind of legalistic and things like that. It's probably something you need to go and do some research in if you do come across it in a contract. Copyright and ownership. I will talk much more about copyright in a minute. Confidentiality, again, just, you know, make sure if it says that it's confidential that you don't go and post work in progress stuff on your Instagram page, because you'll be breaking those terms. And do not compete clauses. You quite often get companies that will say, okay, we're an alcohol brand, for example, a gin brand, and you're doing some work for a gin brand. They might have a clause in their contract that says you can't work for any other drinks brands for 2 or 3 years or something. Just beware of that if you're going to be signing one of those contracts. So read through the contracts, pick out things you'd like them to change. Don't be afraid to have a dialogue about these things. Quite often these companies have like boilerplate contracts that they just send out to everybody. But if you say, I'm not happy with this, I'm not happy with this, I'm not happy with this, 9 times out of 10, they'll be like, sure, fine, and they'll just change it. You don't even have a fight in your hands most of the time. So if they don't have a formal brief, which quite often companies don't, what do you need to know? This is a little bit more of a tricky process where you've got to kind of eke the brief out of your client. So the scope of the project, for example, if you've been asked to design a website for somebody, how many pages are going to be in that website? You know, how complex is this project going to be? If it's an illustration project, how many illustrations are there going to be? Are they going to be really big detailed illustrations or little spot illustrations? How will the work be used and who is it for? Always make sure, like if you're working with a design agency, who their client is. You know, you might have particular feelings on working with a tobacco brand, for example, and they might not be very open about the fact that they're working with a tobacco brand until you're far too far down the line, and then you realise that, oh God, it's Philip Morris and it's an advertising campaign in you know, Eastern Europe, and I'm not comfortable with doing that. So make sure you know exactly who is involved in this process. What's the deadline? Pretty obvious. You need to know that. File formats, make sure you know exactly what kind of file formats they require. The amount of times that I have had clients inquire about, you know, traditional watercolor illustrators, and they've said that they need vector files. I don't know if anyone knows much about file formats, but you can't supply a watercolor file in a vector. It's just not possible. So make sure that you're all kind of square on those kind of things. Dimensions, things like that. If it's an illustration, you might be doing an illustration for a gin bottle label, and so you'd assume that it's only going to be that big, but you know, perhaps they want to use it for advertising, so you might have to do something that's going to be blown up to billboard size. It's good to know that at the beginning of the project. Ask them to supply some references. This is really useful because it does a lot of the work for you. These are some references from a client that was commissioning the illustrator Tatiana Boyko. I showed you her website earlier. And they sent us these two different kinds of references. So this is for a tea brand. She was doing some illustrations for a tea brand. On the left, you can see they've picked out some examples of her work that they particularly liked. So it's a really good kind of way for her to direct it in the right sort of creative direction. They've also done all the work in terms of getting the photography references of the particular botanical plants that she needs to show. And if the client can do that for you, it just saves loads of back and forth in the process. It makes your life much easier. So ask them to provide some references. Then are you just giving them a straightforward quote, or are you going to be pitching for this job against another creative? They might just need you to send over a really simple kind of cost. So this is kind of the rough layout of what I would send the client if I was just doing a very straightforward quote. You have like a little description of the project. If you're an illustrator, you would split your costs into an origination cost. So this is just the basic cost of you sitting down and doing the work. And then there would be a usage license on top of that. This is a really, you know, I could do a whole other 2-hour lecture about usage licenses. I'm going to cover it very, very briefly. But if you were an illustrator, this is something you need to get more into. So you would split your origination and your usage costs. Then you would obviously show a total. You would show your contact details, which obviously so that someone can get hold of you. It's also quite useful to put on the contact details of the person you're talking to. Imagine you're working for someone at a big ad agency. There might be 500 people that work at the ad agency. And if you've been having a dialogue with one particular person, it's always really good to make sure that you put their name on the quote so that, you know, if someone else at the company is trying to track down where this came from, then it's much easier. And then kind of another document to go alongside this, I would send over your own terms and conditions if the client hasn't sent over their own. They might want a more comprehensive kind of pitch document. Now, this is probably more common for the graphic designers in you. So what you might want to show, you know, the client has basically said, oh, we'd really love you to work for this project for us, but, you know, we're contacting a few other people about it and we're gathering like pitches from other people. So how might you approach going about this? I would always try and avoid doing bespoke work for a pitch. Obviously, sometimes they ask for it and it's worth it. You know, you might, you know, want to do some kind of examples of how you might approach the brief, but there's a real problem with kind of pitching for free in this industry, and it's always good to push against it if we can. So, you know, you could put together a really nice document, a really nice PDF document for your client that shows lots of relevant examples of your work. You might put together a timeline of how you're going to work on this project, how long you think it's going to take you in different stages and things like that, make it really nice and clear for the client. Then you would obviously put together your cost proposal like we've just seen. You could suggest potential other deliverables. We do this quite a lot at UTILE. If someone gets in touch with us asking us to deliver a website for them, we would kind of sit down and ask, you know, what else might they need? Potentially, you know, really nicely designed email templates for their e-commerce marketing. So we could kind of suggest that and cost it up for them. They might want things like business cards that sort of match the new website design and things like that. Are there other things that you can kind of spark the client's imagination that they hadn't originally thought of, that they go, oh yeah, that would be useful. Oh, it's good to have a cost for that. Maybe we'll commission that as well. And then instead of doing some kind of bespoke work for this pitch, what we often try and do is just do a little bit of research, show that we understand the brief. This might just be mood boards of things that we have kind of gathered, or it could be other kind of benchmark designs within this sector or something like that. Just a little bit of kind of research just to show that you're interested in the project, you've started thinking about it, that kind of thing. Obviously, if you are going to go and kind of pitch for free and do some work for the client, that's your decision, but we always get stung by it. So just be careful. So congratulations, you've won the job. Yay, pop the celebration corks, you're going to get working. But this is not the time just to let all your kind of business savvy head go out the window and suddenly get lost in a world of being a disorganized creative. You still have to be really on it. So the client will want to brief you. I know a lot of people hate talking on the phone, but it is really, really useful to have a, you know, either a face-to-face conversation with your client on Zoom. It's brilliant that we're all now in a world where Zoom is just the norm because we can do that, or pick up the phone and just have a phone conversation, old school. I think it's really important for you to have like a natural conversation dialogue with your client, because even if they've sent a really nice comprehensive brief, it's still really good to kind of talk about things and eke little other details out, and you'll get a much better idea of who your client is and what they're interested in and things like that if you've had a conversation with them face to face, on the phone, whatever. And also when things, you know, if things get a little bit touchy a little bit further down the line, if you feel like you have a slightly more personal relationship with your client, which only comes about through talking to them, it will be so much easier to kind of handle those bumps with them. So, you know, do a little bit of a meet and greet, shake hands, be nice, chit chat, you know, get to know your client before you start working on the project. I think that's really important. Don't let them drip feed your feedback. So if you're going to put together like a time proposal for your client in your pitch document, we always kind of separate it into kind of rounds of work. And this applies to illustrators and graphic designers. I would say, okay, this is round one. I'm going to do these sketches, then I'll hand it in. Communicate how long they should turn around their feedback. So if this is a really tight deadline project, you don't want to be handing in your work and then waiting 3 days for them to get back to you with their feedback. You need to communicate, okay, if I'm going to meet your deadline, you need to turn around your feedback within 24 hours. And you want them to be delivering really nice, coherent rounds of feedback on your rounds of work. It's a problem, particularly with illustration, where, you know, the illustrator will send over some roughs and then they'll kind of start working on the next round, and then the client will get back to them and be like, oh, actually, I've thought about this thing. Can you just do this as well? Kind of in between stages, and it just makes everything really, really messy. So make sure you have really nice, clear rounds of delivery and feedback, and communicate how long those gaps are going to be. So you've got to the end of the project. Yay, finished, everyone's happy. Brilliant. Now you can invoice. You would usually invoice on completion of the project. Like I said earlier, 30-day payment terms is typical. For some projects, you can ask for an advance payment. So at Utah Studio, if we're working on a particularly big project, we will ask the client if they're happy for us to invoice 50% upfront and then 50% on completion. Obviously, for kind of smaller turnaround projects, that might not be necessary. It might just be making more paperwork for yourself. But if you think it's going to be a project that you're going to be working on for a long period of time, particularly if it's going to take you kind of a month or two, it's really useful in terms of your cash flow to make sure you've got a bit of money up front to keep you going. Right, so I'm kind of going back a little bit. So I mentioned earlier about putting together costs. I discussed licenses. So like I said, if you're an illustrator, this is really, really important for you to understand about licensing. There is not enough time in this discussion for us to get really into the detail of it, but I'm going to give you a little overall impression about what licenses involve. So if you're an illustrator or a photographer, photographers work in the same way. You would create a piece of work for a client and you would give them a license to use the work for a specific purpose. For some reason, graphic design works differently. If you do work for a client, you tend to hand over the copyright to them. That's just the way it is. With photography and illustration, you own the copyright and you retain the copyright. And it's almost like kind of renting your work out to somebody. So it's almost like, you know, you're a car rental service and you own all the cars and you let someone use the car for a certain amount of time for a certain reason. So we own the copyright, and how are we going to structure these licenses? You know, what parameters are we allowing people to use our work within? There are generally 3 sections that we split our licenses into. So time, your client might want to use this particular illustration or photograph for 6 months. They might want to use it for a year. They might want to use it for 3 years. They might want to use it in perpetuity, which means forever. So you can give them different options for that. Territory, so your client might be something very, very local. So it could only be within London, or it could be the whole of the UK, or it might be something that they're going to use, you know, in the whole of Europe or the whole of the world. So if it was an advertising campaign for, I don't know, something very British, I guess O2 or something is a, you know, a British telecoms company, I think. So if you were going to do some illustrations for their ad campaign, it's probably likely they would only ever use that ad campaign within the UK. So you would just give them a license to use it in the UK. But if it was HSBC Bank, for example, which is the world's global bank, they would probably want a license to cover the whole world. And so that's going to be a bigger license for them. So we've limited by time, we've limited by territory, and then there's all the different possible media where your illustrations could appear. So let's say you've done these illustrations for HSBC for an ad campaign. They might want to use them in kind of printed brochures. They might want to use them on the internet. They might want to use them on kind of billboards out in the streets. They might want to use them on a TV advert. The list goes on. You know, there's a big list of different possible media where your work can appear. So again, this is something that you need to dig into. Sounds really basic, but the bigger the license, the more expensive it should be. I hope that makes sense. So if you were giving someone a license to use something forever in the whole world across any possible media, that's going to be a really expensive license compared to your local cafe down the road wanting to use one of your illustrations for a year on some, like, I don't know, printed flyers or something. I hope that makes sense. So the bigger the license, the more expensive it is. Here is just, you know, a breakdown of what I've just been talking about. So time, these different options for time, territory, different media. Your website, online ads is quite different to, you know, the HSBC website compared to if they're doing like those banner ads that you see on websites and things like that. OOH is something that will come up quite a lot if you're an illustrator, which is, it stands for out of home. So that's billboards and anything that's out on the street. So that's a good one to think about. But yeah, brochures in store. If it's a fashion brand, they might want to kind of print it on the walls or in the windows or something like that. Packaging, merchandise, press adverts, you know, the ads that come up in magazines, TV ads, direct mail. It's quite old school these days, but it does sometimes come up in contracts. And then internal comms is an interesting one to think about. If you've ever worked for a really big company, maybe, you know, you've worked for Topshop or something, you might know that there's sort of certain communication stuff that will come from the company that only gets sent to employees. So that's something to think about. It's obviously a big company, but quite a limited audience. Copyright. So there are loads of reasons why we want to hold on to the copyright. Copyright is something that whenever you create a piece of work, an illustration, a piece of writing, a photograph, any kind of creative work, you instantly own something called copyright, which basically means that you have the right to let other people use it in particular ways, you know, print the work, show the work, all that kind of stuff. And there's very specific reasons why, as illustrators and photographers, you want to hold on to the rights for those work. I could go on forever, but here are just a few that I think are really important. The client doesn't need to attribute the artist as the creator of the work. So particularly as illustrators and photographers, our work is very personal. If you've done some really lovely illustration for a brand or a magazine or something like that, and you sign over the copyright, they don't need to say anywhere that you've made that work for them. You have no right to object to any derogatory treatment of the work. So the client could cut up your illustration and put it back together again in some other way that you think looks absolutely awful. And it still looks like your illustration, but they've totally effed with it. And you have absolutely no right to object to the fact that they've done that if you've signed over the copyright to the client. The client has the right to assign a license to anybody in the world to use that work without your permission. So here's a really extreme example, but say you had done some work for a particular branding agency and you'd signed over the copyright to the branding agency. Imagine what would happen if the branding agency then went to go and work on Donald Trump's next presidential campaign, and they find your lovely illustrations in their archive and go, oh, this would be perfect. And then all of a sudden your illustrations are slapped all over Donald Trump's, what would it be, 2025 presidential campaign. You have no right to object to that happening to your work because you've signed over the copyright, you've signed over all interest in those illustrations to somebody else. It is no longer yours. So be very, very careful. So being a professional is basically just being really, really good at admin. And I have learned that, again, the more organized you can be upfront beforehand, the easier your life is further down the line. So how do you calculate a day rate? This is really difficult if you're a graphic designer and you're going to go and, you know, do some freelance day rate type work with an agency. How do you work that out? It's really difficult. So let's imagine you've just come out of uni and like a very junior salary for a very junior graphic designer might be 20k. You know, it's small, but if you kind of look at the job ads that are out there, have a look at kind of jobs boards and things like that, and you will see the kind of salaries that, you know, you would be equivalent to if you were going to go and get a job in an agency. Let's just say, for the purpose of making it nice and easy, 20k. If you were an employee in a company, there are lots and lots of other benefits that you would get that you would not get as a freelancer. So we would potentially add about 30% on top of that 20k to cover things like sick pay, holiday, pensions, all of that kind of stuff, all of the nice things that you get when you have a job in a company. So you suddenly push the amount of money you need to earn every year up to 26k. 252 working days in a year, that is all the days that you could possibly work. So not weekends, not bank holidays. When you divide that 26k by 252, you get £103 a day. But remember, as a freelancer, there's also all of this other admin and account and time that you need to factor in for doing all your admin. You have to file tax returns. You have to be chasing the work. You have to be kind of updating your portfolio to send out to clients. All of these things take time. So that £103 a day is suddenly going to look much smaller in comparison. Also worth bearing in mind that the average freelancer works 220 days per year. So that 252, there's going to be days when you haven't got work on and you're looking for work. So you need to be able to account for those extra days. So that again suddenly pushes up your day rate to about £118 per day. There are loads of different ways of working this out. This one just makes sense to me, but it's worth bearing in mind, you know, what you need to be charging to cover all the things that an employee would be getting. Remember also, you will need to pay tax out of your earnings at some point. So every time you get paid, make sure you're putting that money away into a savings account so that when the tax man comes knocking, you are not suddenly like, oh shit. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on here. But make sure that you have that money saved. It is not yours. It is going to the tax man. Save your contracts and your invoices in a really ordered way. If you can afford to pay for an accounting software like Xero or QuickBooks, it will make your life so much easier in the long run. It might be kind of £8 a month or something that you'll pay to use these services, but honestly, the time it will save you in terms of, you know, filing away your invoices and trying to kind of put together spreadsheets and things like that, it makes my life much easier. I promise you it's worth the money. But if you aren't spending your money on these, you've got to be extra vigilant in terms of, you know, spreadsheets and that kind of thing. And this is where I end, which, you know, I think we've done all right for time. We've got time for questions and things like that. But yeah, the main thing I would say about being a freelancer, you are a little one-man business, and it's really important to treat yourself in that way. There are a few really key things. Just be polite to everybody. You know, even if you have a tricky client that's being a bit of a, still be polite, take the high road, make sure you're being professional and calm in all of these situations. You know, if you've pitched for some work and you didn't happen to get it, still send an email saying thanks for the opportunity. When you kind of nurture these contacts, they will help in the long run. And particularly when you're doing freelance work, you know, if you are a nice person to work for, it just makes your clients' lives so much easier. Honestly, I've worked with illustrators who are exceptionally talented people, but are not easy people to work with. And I will guarantee you that they will not have clients come back to them, despite the fact that, you know, their work is brilliant and, you know, they love what they eventually made. But if you're making people's lives difficult by being a difficult person to work for, you know, they're not going to come back asking for more. And repeat clients are your best clients because you know what they want, you know how to make them tick. Always deliver your work on time. Just goes without saying, it's so simple. If you're having problems with deadlines, you need to always make sure that you're talking to your clients as early as possible. Just deliver your work on time. And just keep building your network. All of these people that you come across in your life, just, you know, be personal, be nice to them, be on places like Twitter and engage in conversations. It's interesting, like the amount of people that sort of you sort of build up these interesting networks with just because you follow them on Twitter and you kind of respond to things and you have a dialogue. Be somewhere like LinkedIn and again, comment on people's work. It's not just all about like expecting the comments to come to you. Build your network. You've got to work at this. And keep in touch with those clients that you've worked with before. If you have done a nice job for them, you can ask to put them on your mailing list. You can keep them updated, maybe update them every year. If you haven't heard from them, send them a Christmas card, build your network. People are really, really important when you're a freelancer. I think that's the most important thing that I've learned. And I would like you to think of that too. So that's it. I guess we can go on to some questions. Shall I stop sharing my screen?
That was some amazing practical advice. Thank you so much, Tess. There were so many insights there for like students to kind of take on board. It was just so invaluable. Thank you.
I'm sorry, it's a bit of a like, there's just a million things to talk about, but I hope, like I said at the beginning, it's just kind of a flavour to get you thinking about all of the different things. And I hope that you can kind of go in and investigate all of those things in much more detail when they come up in real life situations.
No, I think definitely, and there's a lot of practical advice to take on board there as well. We have, so talking to the students and everyone who's watching, if you've got any questions for Tess, please start posting them in the chat now. We have a few questions that students prepared before the session. One student was wanting to know, what made you want to go into freelancing? Because obviously you were working for bigger organisations before, and then you took the leap to freelance. What for you made you want to go freelance?
It was actually not a particularly conscious decision. It was just the circumstances. So I'd been at the Central Illustration for 5 years. I was an employee there, which was very nice. I had holiday benefits, I had sick pay. I decided I wanted to leave, and in the process of kind of investigating what I wanted to do, I actually had like a few different people that I was speaking to that kind of needed my time on a part-time basis. And so actually I just became freelance out of, you know, the fact that I was sort of working across the various different things, if that makes sense. So it wasn't necessarily me thinking, oh, I really want to be freelance. It was more just, it happened because of the circumstances at the time.
It was a sort of natural progression.
Yeah, yeah.
So I've got another question from a student. What's your opinion on using apps like, oh, I've not heard of that one before, like, is it I can't see it, sorry, Fever, to get your work out there as a student? So I suppose maybe your opinion on what are the most successful social media platforms. I know you mentioned Instagram and Twitter, and just a bit more detail about students using those platforms.
Was the platform Fiverr?
Yeah, I think that's it. I can't quite see it. There's a bit of lighting. So yeah, is that how you say it? Thank you.
I think so. I will be honest, I don't know a lot about Fiverr, but from what I've heard, they massively devalue the, you know, illustration and design work. I think they're kind of well known for, you know, people list like the fact that they can do illustration projects for like £15 and things like that, which is just really, really terrible for the industry in general. It does you no favors. I think the better thing to really be doing, because I think the work that you're going to be getting through those kind of websites is not going to be work that you're proud of. I don't think it's going to be good quality work that you're going to be proud to show people. You know, it's going to be people that want a portrait of their dog, or like, you know, someone that want a logo design who are not prepared to pay the proper amount of money for it. They're not clients that you really want to be getting. So my advice would be, like, it's tough, but go and get a part-time job. Like, we've all done it. I spent a good couple of years working in pubs and bars in Bristol before I got a full-time job. And I was working as an illustrator during that time. It is hard, but, you know, put in the work and do the part-time job, and that takes the pressure off you having to earn money from illustration and things like that straight away. And spend the time, your evenings, your weekends, like really, really like building up a portfolio that you are proud of. I think for the amount of money that you're going to earn on a website like Fiverr, like, it's just not worth it. Do you know what I mean? You're better off like going and doing personal projects and building up your portfolio into something really strong. I think there's something I often see. I do a lot of portfolio consultations with illustrators, and you often see illustrators that do a lot of very cheap work, and it's reflected in their portfolio by their portfolio frankly looking quite cheap. And so the only work, you know, this conversation of like, make sure your portfolio is showing the work that you want to get. The illustrators that invest a lot of time and energy in making really beautiful work then eventually will get the kind of commissions from the luxury gin brands and, you know, the luxury kind of nice things that pay really well. You know, it's, you see it as like a business investment. If you invest time in doing things properly and well, the benefits will be that you will get much better quality work out of your portfolio. So avoid Fiverr because they are not good, but there's lots of other apps where you can have your work. I think I mentioned Behance. I think Behance is a really good community, a really good place to have your work. So that's what I would say.
Some more questions coming through. So what do you, sorry, there's a student asking here. I think you kind of answered this before, but when Daniel's asking, do you prefer that when people are applying to specific agencies, that you definitely tailor that portfolio of work to the design agency, or do you? Is that something that you do really advise?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. I mean, obviously, this comes from the benefit of having a big enough portfolio that you can pick and choose. Obviously, if you're a new graduate, you are probably in a position where you have just got enough together to fill up a portfolio. So I appreciate this is potentially wishful thinking, but yes, I think is Daniel a graphic designer or an illustrator, or?
Yeah, kind of graphic design and illustration. He's just saying, how do you know which pieces of work to select when you're tailoring it for an agency? So I suppose, what would you be looking for, which depends on different agencies, really?
Yeah, it really depends. You've just got to do your homework. So if you want to go and do some freelance graphic design work for, a magazine or something, just make sure that everything in your portfolio is kind of tailored towards what a magazine art director would be looking for. If you want to go and work in sort of something more digital, then obviously you need to be kind of tailoring your portfolio towards that. Every agency will have their own website, they will have their own work out there, so just do your homework and kind of look. Also go into places like their Instagram and things like that, because there's lots of interesting stuff to find in there. But just try and kind of mirror a little bit what they're interested in.
I think that's really great advice in terms of just looking and doing your research, which you mentioned before, about how the brand represents itself, what their logo and branding is looking like, and using a similar colour palette when you're selecting work, and just kind of falling in with that.
Yeah.
We've got a question from Lizzie. She's saying that she's doing bits of odd jobs on the side while she's a student. And do you have any tips on how she should maybe be looking to price her work for these kind of side hustle jobs as she's doing as a student?
Oh, it's really difficult, particularly kind of, with pricing anything, there's always this push and pull between, as creatives who are quoting for things, we need to always be trying to kind of push the limits of kind of what we can get, because it benefits the industry as a whole. But at the same time, you have to appreciate that there are lots of very small companies that need to commission things, and they have budgets too. So I've found myself having conversations all the time with clients who I know don't have much to spend. And I will have a frank conversation with them and say, listen, this is what this should cost in terms of industry market rates. And if you're an illustrator, there's plenty of places you can go. The AOI, again, is a really good place to go to find out what those industry rates should be. You can have a conversation with these clients and say, listen, this is what market value of this kind of work would be, but I understand that you have a budget that isn't going to reach that. So I'm happy to do it based on this, but I want you to understand that I'm doing this on that kind of agreement. And there's certain things that you can do to kind of make your life a little bit easier in exchange for that. So again, limiting the amount of rounds of amends that you do for somebody. You might usually do kind of 3 or 4 different rounds of amends for an illustration project, but if they've got a really tight budget, maybe you say, listen, if I can get this done in 2 rounds of amends, then you can pay a little bit less. Do you know what I mean? There's kind of a little bit of push and pull within that, but it is very difficult. It's always good to kind of be doing client work, and you sometimes just have to do it for very little. I would say the only time you should ever work for free for people is for charities. Anyone else, don't do it. If someone is saying to you oh, you're an illustration student, I've got this project, it's going to be great exposure for you, BS. Like, nothing you do is going to be good exposure for yourself, you know, for somebody else. The best exposure you can get is by doing personal work that you feel really passionate about and promoting that. Someone is just trying to get free work out of you.
Brilliant. No, I think, yeah, you're completely right. And a lot of people have mentioned there seems to be this trend of people getting paid with exposure, and it's just not a real concept. And a lot of our guests this week have mentioned that. So it's really great to hear it from you as well. One of our students, Gabby, she's asking about if you've got a client and they're wanting to do more payments around charging for specific things. So if we've got they want just a logo making, and if they want maybe just a leaflet creating, what would be the way that you would price a payment plan for that? Do you have any advice where clients are just wanting single assets, really?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's an interesting one with the leaflets. There is another way that you can price that in terms of license. Are we talking about graphic design here or illustration?
Yeah, Gabby's more of a graphic designer, actually. So yeah, more graphic design realm of things.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of kind of costing things like that, it's really just about working out your day rate and how long you think it's going to take. Like I said, there's the split between graphic design and illustration. If you're an illustrator, it would be a little bit more complex in terms of working out licensing and things like that. But I think if you're a graphic designer and it's, you know, just a company that want a logo and a brochure, it's just a case of sitting down and working out how many days that's going to take you. And I know that's an annoying thing to say because it really comes out of experience, knowing how long that's going to take. But again, there are things you can do, parameters that you can kind of put. So again, you could kind of say like, oh, we'll do this within 3 rounds of work, and you lay out a really kind of detailed timeline, and you say, okay, this project's going to be £500, and we will deliver kind of 2 option roughs, and then, you know, you can pick one that you like and we'll develop that, and then we'll have final tweaks at the end, and we expect this will take you know, 5 days work or something, and you price it based on that.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice, because a lot of my students are being asked, okay, we want just this logo, and students are saying, should I just charge for that? But I think that idea of charging, don't have set prices for logos, have actually a day rate, and think about how long it would take to, you know, if you're starting from scratch or if you're doing a redesign. So I think that's really useful. Thank you. And yeah, Gabby's saying thank you as well. In terms of one of the other questions students were asking me, and you've kind of pointed on it, you kind of mentioned it earlier on, but what was it like for you when you finished university and you went into working in the industry? Was it a really smooth transition, or were there kind of ups and downs? And would you mind kind of giving us a bit of insight to your experience?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is really, really important, because I've spoken to a lot of students this year who are just terrified of graduating into the current economic climate that we're in, which is totally valid. But yeah, for me, I left uni, I went to uni in Bath, I did graphic communication. I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do. I kind of felt like I wanted to be an illustrator, but I just moved to Bristol, and honestly, I just spent 2 years in Bristol working in a pub. I did some shifts in an art gallery on the front desk. I did some illustration in my spare time. Had a really nice time just doing that kind of thing for a couple of years. And then eventually, like, you know, I actually did a couple of little short internships with other illustration agencies, just like short 1 month kind of sprints with agencies, and then a job came up that I applied for. It wasn't wasted time at all. Like, I can appreciate a lot of people are like, oh, she just worked in a pub for 2 years, but like, I loved it. It was great. Met lots of friends, did lots of creative stuff. I had a lot of freedom. So if you are coming out of university at the moment and you don't land a job straight away, totally fine. I have tons of friends also that graduated in 2008 when the last financial crisis hit. And if I look at what they're all doing now, like, they're all like smashing it. You know, one of them is kind of lead account manager at Tommy Hilfiger in Amsterdam. Another one has set up his own business doing kind of display kind of vinyl things. You know, another one is a really successful professional illustrator, and they graduated during an equally bad economic climate. They had a really rough time at the beginning, but you know, it's fine.
Yeah, it's a journey, isn't it?
Definitely is.
Another student is asking, if a project takes longer than expected, is it your problem or the client's, and how do you go about then charging for your time? So if a project starts taking longer, I suppose, like you mentioned before, always do your part to deliver the work on time. But if a project starts taking longer, how would you maybe handle that?
So this is where being really organised at the beginning really benefits. So in terms of the amount of time that a project should take, if you are really clear from the start about what you're quoting and what that involves, so like we said, you can lay out a schedule in terms of rounds of amends that you're going to do. So you could say, okay, week 1 we're going to do this, then we're going to hand in this round of kind of rough work, then you get to feedback, and then we'll have another week where we'll do, development work, and then we'll hand in the project and you get to feedback, and then week 3 we're going to do all the finalizing, and then it's signed off. Within that schedule, you can also kind of say, if this requires extra rounds of amends, extra days, you could say, additional days are priced at £118 a day or whatever your day rate is. Lay out exactly what the menu is from the start and give them a little price list for all the extras. And then you're in a much better position if things do start getting a bit baggy and going on forever, then you've accounted for that right at the start. They know exactly what they're going to get. If they need 4 or 5 extra rounds of amends because they still don't know what they want and you've answered their brief, then it's all there in your contract, in your quote and things like that. Just make sure you get it all in up front.
I think, and that's really important about protecting yourself as well, saying you're only going to do this many rounds of amendments or iterations, because then it can, if a project is taking slightly longer, you can put a full stop into how far involved you are with it. So I think that's really good advice. And that's all the questions that have come through from the students. One more question that I had, which I thought was an interesting question, was what people inspire you kind of at the moment? Who do you look at? Who do you get inspired by?
That's a really good question. So at uni at the moment, I'm studying brands, communication and culture on an MA. So I'm really interested in the world of branding at the moment, and kind of brand strategy. And over the summer, I kind of made acquaintances with a couple of really inspiring women who both work in the world of branding. And what amazes me is just how kind of open they are to helping. And I think, the creative industries can be an amazing place where people are happy to kind of mentor you and offer advice. You can, if you reach out to older people who are sort of a little bit further along in the process, and if you are kind of polite and, ask for their help and their advice, I'm always just blown away by people that are really forthcoming with that help. And I think that kind of inspired me to be I need to be much more generous with my time. I don't know if that's the kind of inspiration you're interested in, but they're both also very good kind of branding strategy people that I obviously admire their work and stuff, but it's more almost their behavior within the industry. And I think it's particularly good within women within the industry. I think we're getting very good at kind of helping each other out. But I don't want men to think that they're kind of excluded from that. But I think, if there is someone that you're really interested in, you love their work, like I said, kind of, if you're on LinkedIn, you can kind of connect with them on LinkedIn. If you're on Twitter, you can kind of respond to tweets and things like that. Just kind of get into their field of vision and their dialogue and, stuff like that.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Tess. So there's no more questions come through from the students, so we'll kind of finish the session there, but really wanted to thank you for all of your insights and advice that you've given out today, because there's so much to take on board, and I think students have got a lot from the session. And while the students begin to leave the session, if you could just hold on and we'll do a bit at the end, if that's okay. There'll be music fading out, but thanks very much. It's been brilliant today.
No worries.
I really appreciate your time.
Lovely to speak to you all.
Nice one. everyone. Thanks very much. Goodbye.